Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Don Chalmers. I'm one of the law professors, and I'm going to be starting off proceedings this evening. Can I welcome you all warmly to this Australian Red Cross and University of Tasmania Red Cross oration. Can I acknowledge this evening the attendance of Ms. Kim Boyer, former Deputy Chancellor and Acting Chancellor of our university. Can I also recognise the attendance of Mr. Michael Legg, the President of the ARC National Board, Russell Penman, the Executive Director for Tasmania, and Lyndall Herbert, the Chair of the Red Cross Advisory Board. And at the back, can I perhaps also mention that Donald Howarth, the partner of our orator, is also here. As a reflection of this institution's recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, the University of Tasmania wishes to acknowledge the Mohinina people, the traditional owners and custodians of the land upon which this campus was built. Very briefly, by background, it was about 15 years ago that some discussion started with the then ARC Tasmania Director, Dr. Ian Burke, with the university, where we thought we should think in terms of launching a nationwide Red Cross lecture. That was eventually brought into fruition some 10 years ago, and it's with considerable pride that the university is partnering with the ARC in presenting these orations. The purpose is hopefully to engage our community with the humanitarian mission of the International Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement, and also to explain and bring into practice the Red Cross values and principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, independence, voluntary service, unity and universality. And if I might be allowed one small personal indulgence, I think qualities which you will find that our orator manifests and represents. The previous Red Cross orations have been on subjects such as bioethics in a globalised world, not surprisingly, international humanitarian law, our future climate, global poverty, diversity in Australia, and trying to imagine a nuclear weapons-free world. We were particularly honoured, the Red Cross and the university, in 2011 when that oration was presented by Yves Dacour, the Director General of the International Commission of the Red Cross. He also talked about the humanitarian challenge, and I think you will see themes of that coming through in our oration this evening. This is the 10th year of the Red Cross oration, and I would like to now invite Mr. Michael Legg, the President of the RC, to introduce our speaker at this very significant milestone in the history of this oration. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor Chalmers, and equally welcome to everybody here this evening to listen to the 2016 Red Cross oration. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce the speaker this evening, and at the end of it, I'm sure you will agree that this is a lady who is a great humanitarian. But I'll leave you to judge that in her after her presentation. But in my eyes, she is a great humanitarian. I've known Anne for a little while now, and equally, it's great that she's been able to come from Western Australia to join us this evening. Just like to give you a little bit of a background about Anne, and then I'll pass the baton over. Anne Marie Carey, born in Dublin in 1958, moved with her large Irish family to Australia in 1969. Left school at 14, and after 6 years in the workforce, joined a missionary order. Studied nursing and midwifery before going to Papua New Guinea, where she ran a remote hospital in a poor rural district of Papua New Guinea. After 18 years in the Order, she left to work in healthcare in remote areas of Australia, interleaved with Red Cross missions in war zones overseas, and completed her Masters in Public Health and Tropical Medicine. She was a member of the Red Cross team that stayed in Jarinda, Sudan. Jarinda was the world's largest refugee camp and had come under armed attack. All other agencies, including the UN, abandoned the camp. Subsequent focus of the world attention on the plight of the refugees and the Red Cross workers prevented subsequent attacks. More recently, Anne Carey became involved in the running of the Red Cross Ebola treatment centres in Sierra Leone. She was there at the height of the epidemic through to the recovery phase. She received the Pride of Australia Care and Compassion Award in 2015 and is the 2016 Western Australian of the Year. The guiding principle by which Anne tries to live is to have the courage to be kind. Currently, as the Western Australian of the Year, it's Anne's intention to channel the same energy that she used to tackle the bully Ebola, with to raise awareness and tackle bullying in the health workforce and unkind treatment of refugees. Anne resides in Esperance with Donald, a doctor who is here this evening with Anne, and they have a fellow companion, Rusty the dog. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Anne Carey.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks very much. Thank you, everybody, for welcoming Donald and I. We left the dog at home in Tasmania. Such a beautiful place to be. I'll put my glasses on. The involvement of Red Cross in the recent Ebola crisis is a natural extension of the actions of the founder, Henry Drouin. In 1859, when Drouin witnessed the suffering of 20,000 casualties of war, he felt compelled to act, and he set about organising the locals to help them. Thus, the Red Cross was born. What followed were the Geneva Conventions and the first Nobel Peace Prize, which went to Drouin. The actions of Drouin can be seen as a personal response to a moment on a battlefield. His actions can be seen more broadly as a call for the courage to be kind. There are many times other than war when courage is needed. Thus it was as stories came out of West Africa about an Ebola outbreak that had overwhelmed the local health industry and was threatening to become a widespread disaster, perhaps even a worldwide disaster. The world seemed to stand paralyzed in fear, and countries set about putting up walls to protect their borders rather than fighting the outbreak at its source. It was like neighbors, each filling their own fire buckets and waiting to defend their own homes rather than teaming up to fight the fire at its source. At a practical level, this response was going to allow the further spread of Ebola and increase the risk of it reaching countries such as Australia. At a humanitarian level, this was like standing back, passively watching a playground bully at work. We need to ask why so many countries seem to be paralyzed at the moment action was needed. We need to ask how we can do better next time. Fear is very powerful at both the individual and the national level. At the individual level, many health workers no doubt wanted to go and help, but feared that they would contract Ebola. Perhaps a greater fear among workers was the fear that they were not they would not be able to cope psychologically with what they would experience. They feared that they would be entering an unimaginable nightmare. I came to see that fear not only could prevent useful actions, it could paralyze the ability to think clearly. Fear is also useful to some. By promising to protect us from the things we fear, some leaders sought to gain popularity. They exaggerated risk and promoted isolation of West Africa and of returning health workers as a simplistic solution. Some actively discouraged health workers from going to West Africa. I believe after a crisis such as this Ebola outbreak, we need to reflect on how we handle the situation and how to perform better in the next such crises. An example of this sort of reflection is the United States Presidential Ethics Commission report, which recognized that it is in the interest of both the US and the world to become positively involved in both crises, in such crises. Courage is the antidote to fear. Courage is not just about protecting our self-interest, it is about kindness to others. I believe through courage and kindness to others, we can transcend fear and respond much more effectively to crises such as the recent Ebola outbreak. Ban Ki-moon summed it up: the best antidote to fear is an effective and urgent response. This Ebola outbreak was much larger than all 20 previous outbreaks together. It was occurring in an area where the health workforce was depleted by recent war, and now Ebola was killing many of the local health workers, which made the situation even less manageable. MSF, which had been involved in Africa's previous outbreaks, found that the task was beyond its resources. Some countries and organizations stepped forward, and my old employer, Red Cross, was one of these. Red Cross provided a boost to the depleted health workforce. They sent battled, hardened teams that could build special field hospitals and the leadership to organize the work. Most importantly, their presence helped the locals to have courage. Their presence said to the locals that they had not been abandoned. Courage, like Ebola, is highly contagious and established itself in our hospitals, contact tracers, and burial teams. Red Cross did not just send people in without preparation. Courage does not equate to recklessness. The people going in were psychologically screened, then they were trained in the use of PPE. PPE, the spacesuit of the Ebola worker, made treating Ebola patients vastly safer. 500,000 PPE suits were required, and Estonia donated these. The Norwegian Air Force delivered them to West Africa. This was an operation that built a community of the courageous. So when I decided to become part of the solution rather than a spectator, it was as a minor pawn in a huge operation. Why don't I take you through some of my personal experiences going to West Africa to illustrate the battleground where fear and courage fought it out. For me, the experience in Sierra Leone was both a very positive one, working with aid workers from within Sierra Leone and those who had gathered from around the globe. At the same time, it was clearly stressful and sad. There was the positive energy of being part of a team that had taken on a massive outbreak. With predictions that millions of lives could be lost, we had a sense of being part of a major medical front line. There was positive energy in the individual stories of why people had assembled in an African town to do a difficult task for others. This was inspiring and made one proud to be human. These nurses and other team members coming together in Africa made you realize that we cared for these people far from our homeland in their time of great need. Each time we admitted a Ebola patient, we reduced the chance of transmission to others. Each safe and dignified burial likewise reduced the spread of the disease. Each admission hopefully improved the chances of survival of the admitted patient. These were all positives. Each admission meant someone may die alone rather than surrounded by their family. That is the hard part. In the first few months of this outbreak, the death rate was 80%. Thus, many of those admitted died, and many of these died alone. Out of fear, many of our patients presented late and were very ill on admission, which gave them little chance of survival. So we often found ourselves caring for people we had almost no time to get to know before they died an awful painful and lonely death. The first time I dressed in the elaborate protective outfit that we wore, I entered the ward just as a 2-week infant began to fit, and he bled to death in my arms. While I found this confronting, I then came to realize his mother sitting with us had lost all 7 of her children and her husband to Ebola. It had taken our whole family. She felt she had no reason to live. I realized then I had no right to self-pity. This was my introduction to Ebola, a disease that takes whoever it pleases, baby, child, brother, sister, mother, and father. Death was stalking West Africa in the same way it had during the plagues of Europe, and it had brought the country to a halt through fear. Schools were closed, health resources were diverted from other diseases such as malaria and maternal health. Many businesses went under. Over the weeks I was there, I saw many children, young adults, women, and men die. Sometimes they would fight so hard to survive and overcome the virus, but the virus would overcome them. Others would be doing well, eating, drinking, talking, and you would think that all is okay and they are going to make it. But the virus would move in swiftly and silently and take them suddenly and alone. That was always something I found hard, that people died alone, some very frightened. I sat with one 16-year-old who arrived from Freetown the day before. His family came. His father was a local doctor who had died treating Ebola patients. Unfortunately, after he contracted the disease, he passed it on to his family, his wife, his mother, 2 sons, one being this 16-year-old, who were all confirmed cases of Ebola. This young man was very sick. I had put up IV fluids and with maybe some hope that he could successfully fight it. I then especially dressed in PPE to go and sit with him for another 40 minutes as he was scared. I held his hand during this time. I told him I'd come from Australia and that my name was Anne. I told him to fight. He died. The next day, his brother, who was doing well, drinking, eating, talking, died. His mother and grandmother did well and survived. Yes, they survived. Yes, there are survivors. Survival was the time to raise our spirits through celebration. With each survivor, we waited for them to be symptom-free and then checked their bloods again to confirm that they are now disease-free. Once the person was declared disease-free, we would celebrate this with the happy day of discharge, which included a discharge shower, which we named the Happy Shower. They received new, uncontaminated clothes, money, food, and transport home to their families. They were given a certificate to say they were free of Ebola, which hopefully overcame community fears that they may be a risk to others. One of the things they received before discharge was a handshake. This handshake symbolizing so much for them, as they have been unable to have such human contact for this time, and now they were free of the virus and could touch other people at last. For the many who did not survive, safe burial became paramount. When people die, it is the most contagious stage of the disease, as the virus has multiplied to huge numbers by the time of death. The virus can remain alive on the corpse for up to 4 days. Families were no longer able to carry out the normal burial practices, such as cleaning and dressing their loved ones. Trained burial teams took over the funerals of all the confirmed and suspected Ebola cases. The body was sprayed with 0.5% chlorine and placed in double body bags. A photo was taken of the face for the family. Family members were invited to the burial but did not always come because of the stigma and fears that surround this disease. If the family were unable to be present, members of the Red Cross performed a combined Christian and Muslim prayer service. Red Cross teams set up a very poignant graveyard for those who died. They replaced the former mass graves with a system of individual name plots. These graveyards were very moving and memorialized those who have lost their battle with this disease. The image of Ebola in the West has been the PPE space outfit. PPE, this stands for Personal Protective Equipment, and the spacesuit appearance of this outfit is what the image of Ebola around the world became. PPE made treating ill Ebola patients safe. With use of PPE, the transmission of Ebola to healthcare workers dropped dramatically. Basically, Ebola is transmitted by contact with body fluids. This means if your entire body is covered, then body fluids cannot make contact with you and you cannot get Ebola. It all sounds very simple. However, it was not that simple. Taking the PPE off involves taking off contaminated layers without becoming infected by contact with any of the contaminated outer surface of the outfit. It has to be done properly. It was being done in tropical heat and humidity after 40 to 60 minutes of being cooped up in a suit that does not let your body heat out. It is always done with a companion present to make sure mistakes do not happen. PPE is uncomfortable and hot, and you can only wear it for 40 to 60 minutes, otherwise you'll get too hot and can collapse. PPE includes triple gloves, so it's hard to do procedures such as putting in drips while in PPE. The gloves also make it hard to have the usual physical contact with patients that is so much of the comforting role nurses perform. PPE has another effect. It helps you disconnect enough from the suffering around you that you can cope better with it. The world needs to learn from this outbreak. While the initial response was slow, and we can concentrate on the negative aspects of that response, there is a positive message. The world recognized that a very nasty disease was probably going to take millions of lives, and some communities did respond in a timely manner, and the response was successful. Red Cross, with its values and commitment to humanity, was a significant part of that response. Red Cross showed without the resources available in our Australian hospitals, we could build a simple hospital and supply simple rehydration and save so many lives. We could persuade people to enter our hospitals to isolate themselves so others could live. We tried to relieve suffering among the dying, and we provided some dignity to safe disposal of dangerously contaminated bodies. Red Cross showed that the combination of knowledge, humanity, and courage, and the rejection of pure self-interest could make a difference. I believe the founder of Red Cross would be proud of what the organization achieved. The US Presidential Commission summed up what the world had learned and how we should prepare better for the next outbreak. Ethics and enlightened interests converge in calling for our country to address epidemics at their source. They also pointed out, needlessly restricting the freedom of experts and caring healthcare workers is both morally wrong and counterproductive. It will do more to lose lives than to save them. This could simply be stated as the courage to be kind would have conquered the outbreak much earlier and much simpler. At an individual level, what did I come back with? What did it change in me? I did not come back with PTSD. I think that child dying in my arms made me recognize it was not about me and my needs. We were there to help, and if we could not save lives, we were there to show the kindness of health carers. As a world, we needed the courage to turn up and be kind to others. All of us going into West Africa had some fear of contracting Ebola. We all had that other fear that was probably stronger for most of us, that we would not cope with what we would see. Many of us on the ground found we were braver than we ever thought we could be. This included the courage not to wall off the suffering around us, but to engage with it. This is the courage to be kind. What else did I learn? You learn to cope with the knowledge that you cannot save everyone, that at times when the admission rate rose, people would die for lack of simple resources. You learn to accept that, so that you could focus your energies in ways that would save as many as possible. You learned how to maintain hope when people were predicting a massive worldwide epidemic. You learned that being in a team of positive people kept hope alive. The courage to be useful and kind was what kept the teams on the ground from despair. This is kindness in action. I also had a lesson or two in the ability of fear to paralyze. On my return to Australia, public health officials were not focusing on educating the public that returning health professionals were not a threat to Australia. Unfortunately, these officials set out to make it appear as if I was under some form of quarantine in order to allay unwarranted fears. The simple reality is that Ebola has not been passed on in the first 3 days of fever, and so if a returning aid worker were to be infected, there would be plenty of time to safely isolate them. The focus here should have been to help people to understand Ebola and help contain the disease. Our role is not to respond to hysteria. Our role is to educate everyone so that we are able to maintain a public health role that is calm and rational. All those who guide public health policy, such as politicians and members of health departments, should read the United States Presidential Ethics Commission report for guidance on how to handle the next Ebola outbreak better. I want to share with you an instance of how easily health professionals who are experts on contagious tropical diseases could be reduced to frighten people who could no longer perform their role. 18 days following my first return and knowing I needed a fresh supply of anti-malarial medication, and with no evidence I had Ebola, an appointment was made for me with a practice that specialized in travel health. On the morning of the appointment, I was phoned and informed that this practice had held a special meeting and decided I was far too great a threat to be allowed inside their doors. So I set off on a packed morning train, walked through the streets of Perth, paused to have a coffee in a cafe, and then, as instructed, made my way to the front door of the practice. I phoned the receptionist and waited for the door to open, just sufficient for an eye to look around and a disconnected hand to toss my medication onto the pavement in front of me. The door shut as I bowed gratefully and collected my package and made my way back through the crowds of Perth. This brought home to me that well-educated, knowledgeable fellow health professionals could be reduced to mere fools by lacking the courage to question fear. We are all capable of panic, but we seldom achieve anything worthwhile when we yield to fear. At a national and international levels, what are the lessons? There are some organizations such as MSF and Red Cross, and some countries such as Norway, Finland, and Cuba, to name just a few, that generously provided teams early in the crisis. These organizations and countries have enriched their histories with a moment that they can be proud of. They have provided an ethical model for others. These are the moments that build nations and organizations. These are the moments that set the moral tone of societies. They separate the givers and the takers. These moments in a nation's history set benchmarks and values that determine how ethical matters are tackled. This includes how we respond to bullying in the workplace and those who seek sanctuary from war. These are the moments when nations and organizations gain the ethical right to pass judgments on others and set the moral compass for their futures. In this crisis, Red Cross responded in a similar way to its founders' actions in that battleground in 1859. I leave it to you all to reflect on I leave it to you all to reflect on how we as a nation responded to Ebola and how we respond to refugees, bullies in the workforce, and the injustices we encounter in our society. I ask you all to leave here and reflect on how we can achieve the courage to be kind. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think from the applause you can understand how moved we have been to listen to this address. Thank you. We have some time for questions, and we have some microphones circulating. So if you'd like to, we have one here.
I'm going to join you. I'm going to stand next to you.
Can I make a special point of how wonderful it is to have a real heroine? My question is, you mentioned that the need of dealing with the problem at the source, and you would think that all the lessons that have been learnt on anything like AIDS, every conceivable thing is to deal with it at the source. Why is that lessons not penetrated at the international level for there to be either a UN team that goes in immediately to deal with these sort of issues, or obviously Red Cross have got an instant response. So the question is, why isn't it acknowledged that that is the strategy for our own safety wherever we are?
I think this was so unusual, this outbreak, because they have had 20 outbreaks in 38 years, and Doctors Without Borders managed them very well, and it came to an end in 3 weeks. But this was huge. This was beyond the resources of the countries, and MSF couldn't manage it. They didn't have the resources. A lot of MSF personnel got sick with it, and it just was so close to all the borders, and it became out of control. They didn't have the PPE outfits. Some of those countries didn't have gloves, so people, the disease spread hugely. And MSF did an amazing job for what they could do, but they needed help, and that's where Red Cross, who hasn't done that type of work before, they also put their hand up and formed teams and went in. So from this, a lot has been learned from this massive outbreak. So there's little bags, I'm sure, packed in countries, and people would respond to an outbreak, and I'm sure it wouldn't get as massive because teams are ready to go in, because we've learned a lot from this outbreak. And the reason why it was slow for countries responding, WHO didn't initially call it for the emergency it was because of reasons they had. They didn't want to frighten people, so it kind of gathered speed. So every time you lost 2 weeks, it doubled, and we know how bad it was and that. But in the end, it had a positive outcome because people went in, lots of countries respond, Red Cross, MSF. So.
We have another question there.
Yes, I'm just wondering, what did Australia do, considering Norway and Finland and the other countries just hopped on right on board? What did Australia do at the time when they should have been doing something? I just wondered if they did anything.
Well, we know that we were surrounded by fear, and fear fear paralyzes people. So we know that of all the countries, Australia didn't do very much, can I say? But Red Cross in Australia did quite a lot, and they had people who did put up their hand to go, especially because there wasn't planes going in to get people out. So when I went, if you got sick, if I broke my leg when I was there, that would be fine. But if you got sick with Ebola, there wasn't planes going in for anybody in the world who was working there. So that was a really big thing. And as we know, the political situation in Australia, there wasn't enough education, so there was a lot of fear. So, and I think in the end, ABBA, who was in charge, and Donald's probably better answering this, but anyway, in the end, in the recovery stage, he and along with Britain, they did put money towards a hospital, a treatment centre in the capital, but that kind of came into the recovery stage of the outbreak and that. Because when I went in October 14, so there was 2 treatment centres for a whole country, and one was run by MSF and one was run by Red Cross. So the outbreak was massive, and there wasn't room for people, and they had to travel from the capital to where I was, which was Kenema, where initially that first outbreak, and they lost a lot of doctors and nurses. So 500 doctors and nurses died in this outbreak. So people don't hear of a lot about those things. So they had to travel all the way up to these treatment centres by ambulance with no aircon and no windows open. So if you didn't have Ebola when you got in, you had it by the time you got out. And a lot of people didn't live through that trip because they were so sick. But in answer to your question, I'm sure as lots of countries, and I'm sure Australia would be one of them, would respond differently. That's why I've been travelling around giving education on it, because hopefully people would question fear.
Sorry, can we just wait till the...
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Just what are things like now? Can we expect another outbreak? Or
I'm pretty sure we would get another outbreak because those countries in Africa are poor and the health services are run down due to war or poverty and that. So what in the world needs to happen, because we're all part of the world, is for the countries who don't have strong health services, they need to be built up very strongly. And one of the organizations obviously is Red Cross, as well as other organizations. They do a lot of work to build up teams on the ground in Africa for lots of things. So if we had strong health services, we wouldn't need to go in as teams responding from a world, because those health services would be strong. At the moment, there's no Ebola in the 3 countries. They're declared free, but we know from the Ebola outbreak that it lives on in sperm and breast milk, but sperm particularly is for up to 4 to 6 months. So men can, obviously go back and they're meant to have protected sex or not have sex, but that's almost impossible for that length of time, I'm sure. So they would transmit Ebola because it lives in the sperm for that many months. So that was always a big thing.
You've probably answered my question. I was going to ask a question about the countries at the source and how have they learned, and in particular how important was educating the local populace and things like this to try and mitigate further outbreaks.
Yeah, so that was massive, and again, Red Cross did an amazing job education, like creating an education surveillance teams, because they didn't have that, so that was huge. And building up the local population, because that's the whole thing, to sustain healthcare in each of the countries and that. So that took a long time, because you had to train people in everything. So all education for that year, just to give you background, stopped in each of those countries. So people weren't allowed to go to school, universities, they weren't allowed to celebrate. Like if their family were in Freetown, they couldn't travel, so all travel stopped. So that was massive for the country. So people gave, people who couldn't go to unis volunteered for the treatment centres. So there was a lot of education, and there was obviously a lot of fear in the countries, and that's why also initially a lot of people died, because they were too afraid to come to the centres. So, because you need to come early to live, because you've only got 7 days in this disease. Does that answer your question? So, and then it went on after in the recovery phase, lots of education and lots of donations that people would have put into Red Cross went to the whole outbreak and into the recovery stage, trying to make those health services strong.
Could you just pass the mic? Ron, you got it? Thank you. And there's another. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very powerful presentation, and I'm just interested to know your thoughts about how it's possible to make the media kinder and be interested in kindness rather than be interested in fear.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I was speaking to a producer, not so long ago who was speaking with teams that he knows, and they were hoping to change that in the media. So because fear seems to be the thing, and that they were trying to bring a kinder way for people to hear and listen to things that are kinder, that would help society. Because I think we need that now more than ever, and that because we seem to hear so much lately that's doesn't have any kindness in it, and I think we could help change the world through kindness. So, and I think it needs to start at individuals, and perhaps maybe individuals and communities could get in touch with their politicians in that area to ask for this, like, because we could help change this and become, instead of an individual, you can become communities in it, and it can spread. It's not hard. I've been talking about it all year, so I feel really strong on it. So,
I'm sorry to take the conversation back a little bit. The loss of 500 doctors and nurses in those countries was catastrophic, absolutely catastrophic, because we know the percentage of doctors in the communities. Is there a concerted program to try to replace those doctors? And nurses, we're talking about years of training. And as part of that question, has WHO really helped in that?
I don't know the answer in regards, unless someone else does, and I don't know. Donald, do you know the answer to that? But one of the things, because Donald does a lot of reading, that's why I asked Donald. But one of the things I did think when I came out of the country, it would have been nice from each country of the world to donate 2 scholarships to create scholarships for medicine or nurses, because, like, for example, in the area I was in, there was a doctor, and he was specialized in his field with tropical diseases, and he was only 36, and he died from Ebola. And so it was massive loss for each of the countries. So I don't know. That's all I know, really, in that area.
Are you suggesting, Emeritus Professor, that we should in fact be writing to the university to suggest such a scholarship?
Yes.
I shall be delighted on behalf of not only this audience but the other in the north to pass that request on.
Well,
Thank you.
I think it's a very major problem. I mean, I remember hearing the percentage of doctors per population base in several of those countries, and to lose 500 is an absolute catastrophe. And one would just hope that medical authorities, I mean, the money is part of it and scholarships is part of it, but the real issue is one would hope that medical and nursing authorities have some sort of concerted program, because this is absolutely major. And the scholarship idea, I mean, that's obvious, but the bigger issue, and the money is obvious, but the bigger issue is actually the will and the realisation of how absolutely catastrophic that is to lose that number of staff in such a country.
And the wisdom of those people. And also Cuba lost 2 of their doctors when, because they gave a huge medical team into West Africa, and they lost 2 of their doctors. So it's just good to know this, because you don't hear of it, the human loss.
That raises the question, how come they were so ignorant to go in without suits and something to protect them, so that you've already got all those negatives that are giving rise to valid fears for anyone going in?
So you mean the Cuban doctors?
I mean the local doctors. I mean,
well, no, but
they must have the knowledge that they have to be protected.
Yeah, but they didn't have Ebola in these countries. So Ebola is very similar at the beginning to malaria and lots of other tropical diseases. So fever, pains and aches, flu-like symptoms, and malaria is exactly like that. And then, so they never had it before. And they didn't have those outfits in their countries. So, by the time they would have responded, and lots of mothers died because they're the carers of families and that. So by the time, they realized it was that, they didn't have the outfits in the country. Estonia had to donate $500,000. So the tragic loss to millions of people was amazing. Thousands of people.
I think Donald is being very dutiful in answering the question.
I just wanted to make a comment. There was a statistic that I dug up for members of a team that were teaching in Somalia, and that was that 1/3 of African hospitals do not have electricity, 1/3 do not have running water, and 1/3 do not have oxygen. And another third have electricity part of the time, another third have oxygen a part of the time, another third have whatever the other one was. So the resources are very, very thin, and you use what you can. I know that we've taken gloves over there and they get washed again and again and again until they leak. Simple things like endotracheal tubes for intubating patients for anaesthesia that we throw away. They get washed again and again and again until the balloons leak. So, something like a PPE outfit would be an expensive resource for those communities that they just wouldn't even think of stocking.
Because also the PPE outfit, you can only wear it. Everything is single use. You have to burn it because it's contaminated.
So what can we in Australia do now?
To be kinder? What do you think you can do? I'm going to throw the question out. I've got lots of ideas, but yes. Annie?
I think we could help by increasing foreign aid in Australia rather than decreasing it. At least Britain, for its many faults, and I'm come from England, does give a huge amount of foreign aid, and they sent the British Army over, I think, to Sierra Leone to build hospitals, and I was appalled by what happened in Australia and the reaction of our government. And if we want to help the world, and people are concerned about refugees and asylum seekers, instead of locking up innocent people, we should be trying to help people stay in their own countries by giving more foreign aid and solving problems, not just having this isolationist approach.
Yes.
And so I'm going to stop now before I start raving.
I should tell everyone that our former Deputy Chancellor and Acting Chancellor is resplendent in what looks like a Che Guevara T-shirt.
Absolutely, Don. And Anne made some really positive comments about the Cuban health system, which I had the pleasure of experiencing in a positive way. But my question is actually back to the Australian health system. How are you now getting on with that GP practice that tossed your tablets out the window? And are they kinder now?
Oh, I don't know. I've never been back.
You mean you haven't been back?
No, I haven't been, because I got my medication and I kept going. That's all I wanted, really. So, and I don't name them because, they probably, maybe they've been to the talks. Anyway, my thing is not to pick on them. It's just an example of what fear does to people, because it was 18, I didn't have Ebola, but they were really afraid. And then, as a lot of health personnel, when I came back, if they're in the supermarket, they would walk another aisle a little bit further, and that for me. So it's just an example. But what about other ideas of kindness? So we don't lose.
If I could just speak more idealistically, really, not just in terms of facts, we don't have to worry about the media and kindness. I mean, we actually have to start much lower than that. It's a grassroots thing in Australia at the moment. I mean, the media will reflect what the people think, but I mean, the loss of kindness in the interests of efficiency is really quite frightening at the moment. And one could talk for a long time about that, and I won't. But that really should exercise our mind as to how do we get a kindness revolution going, really. Because there's something else that's going on that is destroying something that is intrinsic in the Australian ethos of kindness really has been, apart from all the terrible things that people have done in the interests of efficiency, kindness has been a very big hallmark of the Australian spirit, and it's not there as clearly as it could be, and yet we have examples like you that rise up and give us examples of how it could be there again.
Thank you. But that's also, we need to talk, I think you need to talk to your local politicians to make them aware that that's what you want, because you don't want all this fear all the time, which has been thrown us from all sides. And that. So I think we have to stand up and have that courage to stand up and do that.
Take another couple of questions. Thank you.
I've really been so impressed by your talk. I'm not a particularly well-educated person, but on the subject of kindness, I think the way people connect nowadays with their phones and all the various ways that we're all in contact with each other in ways that don't encourage warmth and kindness, but rather are brief and not particularly polite. Perhaps we need to think of ways of putting kindness in there. It's the only way I can think of answering your question as to how to increase kindness.
That's a really good answer.
A kindness app or something.
Yeah, that's lovely.
Well, if there are no further questions, that is a beautiful moment, I think, to conclude the questions. Can I say that I was remiss of me not to mention in my introduction that our orator for this year has been the second in the 10 years who very kindly went to both Burnie, Launceston and here, so she has worked very, very hard indeed. And with that comment, may I ask our Executive Director from Tasmania, Russell Penman, to close proceedings. Thank you.
Can I first of all just acknowledge the partnership we have with the University of Tasmania, Professor Chalmers, the rest of the committee that work to put this event on each year, in particular Pat McConville, who's hiding up the back there somewhere, Belinda Brock, who do all the hard work behind the scenes to make these events run smoothly. So thank you, and we certainly appreciate and intend to continue that partnership for a long time to come. I don't know about you guys, but there's a few things that I've learned from tonight's presentation. One is, as I was once advised but ignored, if you get the opportunity to open something or close it, choose to open, because you're likely to follow somebody who's amazing, and so your bit then becomes irrelevant. Second part is that, as Michael Legg said in the opening, we were about to meet a great humanitarian, and I think Anne has certainly demonstrated that to us throughout the presentation. Third thing I learned was that somebody in the audience is fantastic at also identifying heroines, because I think that label sits very neatly with the work that Anne has done over her career as well. It gives me great pleasure to acknowledge Anne's contribution to Red Cross through the work she's done beyond Red Cross, and also the quality in which she has demonstrated in sharing that with us tonight. I do have a little gift to express our gratitude.
Oh, hiding.
Here's something I prepared earlier.
He baked it. No.
I wish. And I guess the last thing that I learned was the simple statement that the antidote to fear is courage. And I think it was a great conversation about how do we build kindness is through building courage. I would encourage all of you to demonstrate that courage, but also to elicit it from your networks. And for those of you who are like-minded, to perhaps become part of the Red Cross family and help us to expand that message of kindness and courage as well. Please join me in thanking Anne for tonight's presentation. That's the end of the evening, folks. That's the end of the evening, folks. That's the end of the evening, folks. That's the end of the evening, folks.